Hello, Cheryl here. I'm coming in a bit early just to make sure that things are working and that I can see you okay. I'm not sure if it's... Oh, it is. Okay. So let me make sure. We are a couple of minutes early, but I'm on my own today, so I wanted to make sure that all was working. I'm trying to see if I can see you on my computer, so I'll be able to see what you're seeing as we go along. So I hope you're all well. Yes, oh great, it's just come up. It always takes a little longer than I think and it makes me panic a bit. Anyway, no need to panic now. You're here. So I hope you can hear me. If somebody is already watching, which is great. If somebody could just tell me that you can hear me, then I shall feel so much better about that. Loud and clear. That's wonderful. Thank you, Carl, and thank you, Dawn, for that. That's wonderful. Now I can enjoy this a bit more now that I know you can hear me. Right, we're starting just a minute. It's 6:59 now. But wow, it's hot. I'm back in Florida now and it's super hot. I'm not sure what your weather is like, but hopefully you're enjoying some nice summery weather without too many storms. Oh, it's 7 o'clock. That last minute really flies, doesn't it? Anyway, welcome indeed to Knitter Matters. This is season 2, episode 23. I know you can hear me because 2 of you have already told me that, and I thank you for that. So thank you so much for taking the time to join me today, whether you're watching live or the replay later. I do really appreciate you taking the time. I'm Cheryl Lampard. I'm an image consultant. My company is Style Matters International. And apart from image, I've had 2 passions throughout my life, which are sewing and knitting. And knitting in particular is my sort of therapy. It's the thing that I love to do. It calms me down and I create beautiful things with it, as I know you do too. I also used to be the proud owner of a yarn store in Brighton, England. And one of the great joys of owning a yarn store is that you get to be able to teach people how to knit. And it's wonderful. It's perhaps even nicer being able to do it these days because of social media. I can actually reach to more people and be an educator to more people. So it's wonderful to be able to introduce people to this wonderful fiber art. Now you'll see I'm back in my studio in Naples, Florida, which is wonderful for me. But the only downside of that is that I don't actually have anyone to help me with the camera this week. So I'm back to having to move the camera and asking you to bear with me while I wiggle it about and get it in position. So I'm going to do that right now. So I will ask you to look away if that sort of thing makes you dizzy. And I'll keep talking to you while I'm moving it. I will try and say hello to you as your names came up, Oh, Patricia, I can see you, and Barbara, that's wonderful. Gosh, Judith, can you believe it? I think I might have got this right first time. Well, that would be a first. So I'm just waiting for it to come up on the screen so I can see what you can see. Oh, I think we're in focus, so that's great. Okay. Well, today is all about gauge and tension. What are they and why does it get confusing? Ooh, I think we're wobbling a bit. Sorry about that. I'll see if I can steady it a fraction. Sorry, just wiggling. Okay, it'll calm down. I will try not to knock it. So gauge and tension. Now, the dictionary defines gauge as a thickness, size, or capacity of something, or an instrument to measure those elements. That's the dictionary definition. Tension is defined as a state of being stretched or strained, applying force to something, to stretch it, in other words. So in knitting, tension refers to personal knitting tension. We tend to put a certain amount of strain, tension on the yarn as we're knitting it, and everyone has their own tension. If you give a group of knitters the same yarn, the same needles and pattern, you'll get several different sizes of the finished piece. And that all really comes down to how tightly we knit, how tightly we hold the yarn and sort of maneuver it as we're knitting. And knitting tension, to make things simple, knitting tension is usually classified as loose, tight, or average. Now, I have a tendency to knit with an average tension with finer yarns, but I get looser when I'm using really big, thick needles or yarns with no give. But here's the thing, yarn, needle type, even your mood can affect tension. Have you ever put a piece of knitting away for a length of time, maybe some weeks or months, then restarted it? Well, it's quite possible you saw a difference in your knitting tension. And I'll show you these samples in greater detail a bit later, but I've labelled them because you can see that although they're all 5 inches square, and I've used the same yarn, I don't know if you can actually see the writing, but they are all 5 inches square, and I've used the same yarn, which is a worsted wool. But on every one of them, depending on the stitch, it's a slightly different tension. Sorry, done it myself now. It's a slightly different gauge. Okay, so let me explain the difference and why there's a confusion with the tension and gauge. Now, other than beginners whose personal tension improves as they practice and become more proficient, tension is unique to the user. You can't really change it. Gauge, however, is a bit simpler. It's the measurement of the number of rows and the number of stitches per inch for a particular knitted piece. So on this piece of ribbon, for example, I cast on 38 stitches. The gauge is 7.5 stitches per inch and 7.5 rows per inch, and that's on a needle size 3.75 millimeter, if you will. On this one, for example, I cast on 26 stitches. My gauge is different. It's 5.25 stitches per inch. Well, you can't, of course, count a quarter of a stitch, but you would do this in a 4-inch square, and we'll come to that in a minute. And it's 10 rows per inch. Different needle size, same yarn. So depending on your stitch, depending on the pattern, you may have to change needle size. Again, we're going to go over that. But so I've just explained that tension refers to your personal knitting tension, and gauge is the measurement of the number of rows and stitches per inch for a particular knitted piece. So tension and gauge do mean completely different things, but they've kind of become interchangeable in our lexicon, almost as if they're the same thing. So why is that, do you think? Well, one of the reasons is the different terminology that's expressed in knitting patterns. Oh, I can see Peggy Ann has joined us, and Kim Bradbourne. Thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate it. So in the UK, knitting patterns, and I'm going to show you an example here. Knitting patterns say, let me see if I can just get this under. Hopefully you can see that. It actually says tension. This is a UK knitting pattern. It says tension. Okay. It's the same thing in this instance as gauge. With US knitting patterns, they refer to the same thing as gauge. So tension and gauge in that sense, in terms of patterns giving a parameter for the rows and stitches, tension and gauge are interchangeable. I believe also that in Canada, tension is a more preferred word for knitting patterns, but if there's anyone watching from Canada and you know the answer, please do let me know. I'm not sure about that one. But certainly in the UK, tension is what is referred to as gauge. I do think this a bit confusing that in the UK we refer to tension and it really means personal tension. But there's actually no confusion here, because it's quite clear here. There's a set of stitches and row formula. There's a formula there for what they want you to knit for this particular pattern, and likewise here. In fact, there's 2 gauges here because the pattern actually requires that. All right, so that shouldn't be confusing, but otherwise the words are not really interchangeable. So I would try and get in the habit of saying gauge for the actual formula that you require for the pattern, and tension when it relates to personal tension. Okay, so having said that, then imagine the challenges of the pattern designer. How can they account for each knitter's tension quirks so that tight knitters and loose knitters obtain equally sized garments. So that's where gauge comes in and why it's important. And the pattern will state the gauge necessary using the specified yarn and needle size so as to achieve the correct size for that design. So in this instance, and I'll just pick up this piece of paper because it's easier to handle than the book. So in this particular example, the first gauge you need is 21 stitches and 36 rows that equal 4 inches over stocking stitch. This is knit in the round, so it's just saying knit back and forth in rows. So again, that's important too, and we'll come back to that. The second gauge here changes slightly. It's 26 stitches and 30 rounds. So to start off with, it looks like they're knitting backwards and forth, flat knitting, and then they join it and it's in the round. But again, stocking stitch and chart pattern. Okay, it says quite clearly that. And that's important that you read that gauge. So essentially, gauge is a method of measuring tension. If it's confusing for you to think of gauge and tension, just think that gauge is a method of measuring tension. Now, you can't change your personal tension, but you can change your gauge. And that little box or sentence at the beginning of pattern, the instruction that many of us have ignored, this one, well, because we ignore it because we want to get on and start the knitting, but it's vital. And I would suggest that you ignore it at your peril, because you may well end up with a garment that doesn't fit because it'll end up too big or too small. And I want to point this out too, and I've highlighted this. This little cowl pattern says, take time to check gauge. And I'm glad they say that, because yes, you should. And the way to do it is to do a gauge swatch. Yes, I can hear you groaning at that. But I always do a gauge swatch, always. Did I always used to do that? No, I didn't. But in the last 20 years or so or more, I've realized, I've understood completely why gauge matters so much. And I always do a swatch. And I actually really like doing the swatches now. And you can use them for all sorts of things afterwards. It's great for taking with you to match buttons or trims. You can wash it. You can see how it behaves in the knitted fabric. So I keep my gauges, my gauge swatches, and I label them. And yes, I'm a bit of a nerd like that, but I do it, and it's really valuable. Because if you actually do knit the same pattern in the same yarn later, you can probably skip a few steps because you know how your gauge is going to be with that pattern, that needle, and that yarn. So achieving pattern gauge depends on 3 things. It depends on needle size, yarn weight, and personal tension. You can't control your knitting tension, but you can substitute a stated yarn for another of the same weight. Now, I don't want us to get sidetracked with that now. Let's just assume that we're using the yarn in our pattern, in a hypothetical pattern. So there's one element left there, because we know we can't change our personal tension. We're going to assume that we're using the yarn that the pattern says to use. So there's one element left now, needle size. And you can certainly control the needle size and use it to alter your gauge. So let me show you something in this book. This is the Vogue knitting book that I talked about before. Okay, and I know that's looms a bit big there. It's a wonderful book. It's one of my favorites. I want to show you this page. Let me just get this lined up. Hopefully you can see that. This is the bit I want you to look at. These are 3 different swatches here. Let's make sure you can see that rather than... Okay, you can. This is the one we're looking at. These 3 swatches have been done using the same number of stitches and rows and using the same yarn, but each has been done on a different needle size. And you can see quite clearly how the swatches differ in size. The smaller the swatch, the smaller the needle, the smaller the swatch becomes. The larger the needle, the bigger it becomes, both in width and in height. And remember, it's the same number of stitches for each of these and the same number of rows. But that's the difference on a swatch with 3 different needle sizes using stockinette stitch. And again, I'll explain more about that in a moment, but hold that thought, because it's actually very important. So, a gauge swatch. Don't rush straight to trying to measure your knitting in progress. Fabric moves differently on the needles and when it's not blocked. So unless the gauge instruction says measure unblocked, assume your swatch needs blocking before measuring. Now, a typical gauge size is 4 by 4 inches. Sometimes it's measured in centimeters, 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters. Measure it in the measurement that it's actually given to you, okay, or that it's quoted. So, as I said, assume, I'll come back to the blocking in a minute. So a typical gauge is 4 by 4. So if the gauge size is given in centimeters, measure it in centimeters. But you want to knit the swatch larger than the stated gauge, okay? So let's say our pattern, our hypothetical pattern, asks for 22 stitches and 30 rows to 4 inches, to a 4-inch square. Now, if I only cast on 22 stitches, it's not going to be so easy to measure. And I won't be able to count the stitches accurately. Edge stitches aren't the same size as the stitches in the rest of the fabric, so I won't get an accurate count. But I need to calculate to make a swatch a bit bigger. So although typically a swatch is measured in 4 inches, you could make it 5 inches, 6 inches, whatever you want. You probably don't want to make it that big because you want to get your swatch done and looked after, and then you can start on your knitting. But how do you calculate how many stitches you need to cast on? Well, I needed to make these very accurate. So I needed to actually fine tune that. You can just cast on, if it says you need 22 stitches, you could cast on, 28, 29, 30, that's fine. I needed to be very specific about this for reasons that I'll mention in a minute. So if you do need to be specific about the working up the per inch measurement, and we're talking about the stitches at the moment rather than the rows, 22 stitches, okay, that's what the pattern says. Our hypothetical pattern here wants 22 stitches and 30 rows. So 22 stitches divided by 4 is 5.5 stitches. That's 5.5 stitches per inch. That's 27.5 stitches for 5 inches. Well, obviously I can't cast on a half stitch, so I cast on 28 stitches for this. And I didn't just knit 30 rows, I did more than that. I did about 36 here, and then I bound off. Now, whilst you shouldn't be measuring your work while it's still on the needles because the fabric behaves differently, you can, if you wish, just take the knitting off the needles, lay it flat and measure it. But if you're a perfectionist like I am, or your item or your garment needs precise sizing, I would recommend blocking. Now, this is a blocked swatch. The reason you want to block your swatch before measuring is that blocking can actually change the size a bit. It can smooth out stitches, particularly if you've got a pattern that pulls it in, something like a cable, for example. When you do a swatch, when you do cables, just the nature of this twisted pattern, it's going to pull it in. So without blocking, you're going to get a different, if you counted the stitches without blocking, you're going to get a different result. Now, there are some patterns that will say measure unblocked. So unless the pattern states otherwise, you want to assume that the pattern is a blocked gauge. I'll say that again. Unless the pattern states otherwise, and sometimes they do, assume that the gauge in the pattern is a blocked gauge, because designers nearly always give the blocked gauge size and will state if otherwise. In fact, this little pattern here that I've done this sort of fancy, I showed you how to do this fancy border at one stage, or I showed it as a piece. This is a sort of a wrap. It's called the chine shawl. This actually says gauge is not critical on this garment. Sometimes you will see that. You might see it on, again, something like this where gauge isn't critical, or you might see it on toys or little decorations, the little Christmas decorations that we did at the end of last year. I didn't put a gauge on those patterns because you didn't really need it. So as long as you're using the same type of yarn, it won't matter too much if your gauge isn't perfect. So if you hate checking gauges, look for patterns that don't require a gauge, but you're not going to find too many like that. So you might have to just resort to checking gauge, which is perfect and fine by me. So designers nearly always give the block gauge size and will state if that's not the case. Now, the other reason for blocking is that you want an accurate depiction of how the knitted fabric behaves in real life. You know, it's a sample size test drive of your about to be knitted piece, and you would block it according to the instructions on the ball band, depending what the yarn is. It'll tell you how to block it. If it's an acrylic, you're going to block it in a different way to a wool yarn. Now, I do know that you want to start knitting and that swatches are a bore, but think about it. An evening of preparation is much, much better than hours and hours of work, only to find that your gorgeous new sweater doesn't fit you in the way you'd like it to. That's an awful lot of wasted effort and time. So once your gauge sample is washed, blocked and dry, it's time for measuring. So what you want to do is lay your sample flat and without stretching it. As I said, this is a blocked sample, but let the fabric do what it wants to do. And then you measure a 4-inch square. Now, you can do it with a tape measure. I prefer a firmer, a ruler type measure because it doesn't waffle around on the piece. This little handy dandy tool has got this 2-inch piece here cut out so you can count the stitches and count the rows. This is a very useful one. Or you can simply count your rows from this side if you want, and your stitches from this side if that's what you choose to do. This one is a really nice gauge. I like this for bigger pieces because you can really get your 4-inch gauge there. You can really see that. You can see the 4 inches going across there, and you can see the 4 inches going up. So you don't have to worry about that, because sometimes you will get a gauge that's almost an odd number. So if you're only counting 2 inches, you might have half a stitch. So it could be 10.5 stitches to 2 inches, maybe, or 10.5 rows to 2 inches, something like that. So actually measuring the full 4 inches is good. So let's just see if we are true to form here. So I am going to actually switch to the 2-inch one just for time saving here, rather than counting along the entire 4 inches. So you want to level that up. I want to see where I'm sort of positioning this slightly sideways here, which is very clever. Okay, so I'm looking for these V's here. I'm going to count my V's of the stockinette stitch. And if I didn't say so, if you must check the gauge in the stitch pattern that the pattern says. So if it says gauge over stocking stitch, you know you need to do stockinette stitch. If it says gauge over the pattern, you need to do the pattern, because as I showed you before with the cable pattern, that's really going to pull the knitting in, and you're not going to get the same result as you would with stockinette stitch. You'll get a different stitch and row count. Okay, so let's just have a look here. So I'm looking at these V's. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Okay, so that's 11 stitches over 2 inches. I know that I need 22 stitches for my 4 inches, so that's good. That's going to work out. If I had a stitch showing there, I would want to use this one to really make sure, because that could alter my stitch count on the 4 inches from 22 stitches to maybe 23. Okay, so I do know that my gauge also, so then we would count the rows as well. Now row gauge does matter, but it's not as critical as the stitch gauge. But again, I'll come back to that. So let's have a look at this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, 13, 14, 15. Now you see I've almost got half a stitch there. Got half a stitch there. So actually my row gauge is a little different. If I multiply that twice, my row gauge, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Yeah, it's about 15 and a half stitches, not quite a full one there. So I would, 2 times 2 of 15 and a half stitches, that would be 31 stitches. Okay, so that's still okay. And again, I'll mention that in a minute. I'll talk about why that could matter in a minute. So I know my hypothetical pattern here requires 22 stitches and 30 rows. I've got 22 stitches to my 4 inches, and I've kind of got about 31 rows to my 4-inch square. That's fine. That's fine for this purpose. But what if I have more stitches to my 4-inch square than 22? And again, let's talk about the stitches for the moment. Now that means that I'm knitting a bit tight. If I've got more stitches than the 22 to my 4-inch square, I'm knitting a bit tight. So I'd want to reknit that swatch using a needle a size larger. So if my knitting is too tight and I'm getting more stitches to my square, to my 4 inches, I'm knitting too tight. So I'd need to reknit that swatch going up a needle size, and I might even have to go up a couple of needle sizes. If I've got fewer stitches to my 4-inch square, it means my knitting's a bit loose, so I'd want to go down a needle size or 2. So if it's fewer stitches, the knitting's going to be looser than the gauge requires, so I need to go down a needle size or 2. Now, I would recommend not going up too much of a jump. I always like to think of needle sizes in millimeter sizes. I think that is just, they're actually more accurate, but that's a whole other thing. But needle sizes in millimeters are slightly more accurate than the US sizing and what used to be the old British sizing, where it was 1, 2, 3 and onwards. Because there are some millimeter sizes that don't actually exist in a US needle size. Anyway, but you can go up in a 0.5 millimeter increment. So if I used a 4 millimeter needle, I'd try going up to a 4.5 millimeter next, a 4.5 millimeter needle next, and then maybe a 4.75 millimeter if I was knitting too tightly. So I'd need to go to a bigger needle. If I'm knitting too loosely, I'd want to go from a 4 millimeter to a 3.75 millimeter and then try a 3.5 millimeter, 3.5 millimeter. That's if I'm knitting too loosely, because if I'm knitting too loosely, I need a smaller size needle to tighten up my personal tension. So we could say, well, does it really matter if it's 1 or 2 stitches more than the gauge specified? Well, maybe not if you're only knitting washcloths or blanket squares, for example. You could think of these as little squares for a blanket or a pillow or cushion. But I want you to think about those stitches across the width of a garment. Let's say the pattern states that the finished garment size at the chest, needs to be 40 inches. That's 10 4-inch blocks, if you like, 10 4-inch widths. Now, 2 fewer stitches on each of those 4 inches makes 20 stitches. 20 stitches around the circumference of the sweater. So that's nearly 4 inches. So that would make your finished sweater nearly 4 inches smaller than the stated size. So when you think, well, it's only 1 or 2 stitches across 4 inches, yeah, that's fine if you're only making 4-inch or 5-inch squares. But if you're making a garment, scale that up. If that's across the chest size or even the hip size, you're making a garment to fit a 40-inch chest. That's 10 widths of 4 inches. So if you've got even just 1 stitch fewer on each of those 4-inch widths, that would be 10 stitches. So around a chest circumference, that would be 2 inches. If you've got 2 fewer stitches, that's 4 inches. That could mean the difference between the sweater fitting you or the person you're making for or not fitting them at all. And 2 stitches more stitches than the stated gauge, for example, could mean a sweater that's 4 inches larger than you intended. Again, that might not be a problem if you like a looser look, but if you're making a child's garment, 2 stitches more than the stated gauge could mean a huge sweater on a small child. So it does matter. Now, I said I'd come back to row gauge. Does row gauge matter? Well, yes, it does matter. But if you think about it, many people state that you knit for a certain length. So it's actually not as crucial there. Where it does make a difference is if you have a number of pattern repeats. For example, get my little sample here. If you have certain pattern repeats, like this sort of feather and fan pattern, now these are sort of 4-row repeats, but you could have something that's bigger than that. You might want a cable pattern to finish at a certain point. You might want this sort of basket weave design to finish at a certain point. And certainly if you were doing something like stranded knitting or fair isle, where it's crucial for a pattern to be finished maybe at the neckline or at a certain point, you would want to really make sure that your row gauge was correct, or as correct as you could get it. So just as a word of caution, I talked about going up or down needle sizes, and if you need to go up and down several needle sizes, although you might actually achieve the correct gauge, it's going to change the handle and the feel of the fabric considerably. So if you had to go up 3 needle sizes, for example, you could end up with either a very tight, stiff fabric or a really loose, floppy fabric. So if you went down needle sizes to make a tighter fabric, it could end up too tight and you might end up with a stiff fabric. Or if you needed to go up needle size, if you have to go up too many, you could end up with something loose and floppy. So in that instance, you may have to change the yarn weight instead. Again, the only way to know for sure is to make a gauge swatch. Okay. Now, I said to you that I was doing these 5-inch samples. The reason these are all labelled so intricately and carefully is because these 5-inch squares. I needed to do this for my submission to the Craft Yarn Council for their certified instructor program. And they were very specific about them being 5-inch swatches. So I had to work this out for every single one. And again, as I said, the yarn was the same, but you can see here, I had to really play about with needle sizes for some of these. This simple lace pattern, for example, the gauge was 5.5 stitches per inch and 8.5 rows per inch. I cast on using a certain size, and then I changed to a smaller size because I found it was too tight at the edge, for example. This one, this cable, I cast on 36 stitches for this, and I've got 7.25 stitches per inch. Well, we can't count a quarter of an inch, but that means that essentially I got 30 stitches per inch and 30 stitches across 4 inches. Okay, although this is 5 inches, and it's 9 rows per inch on that. So you can see that's a very different gauge to some of the others. This feather and fan design, there's only 7.5 rows per inch on that one, whereas with a cable it's 9 rows per inch. And I went to a different needle size on this one, and I went to a bigger needle size on this one, which you often do with a lacy pattern. So anyway, the good thing is I passed my CYC Certified Instructor Program, and I'm just waiting to receive my certificate and pin. But the point I'm trying to make is that these had to be a certain size, so I had to sort of reverse engineer so I could decide on how many stitches I needed for my 5-inch squares. And I had several goes at them. This was actually quite interesting to me, this one, which I will just show before we finish. So we have 2 samples here that look very similar. It's just garter stitch. Well, one of them is garter stitch with pearl, using pearl stitches only, and the other, let's put them side by side so you can see, is garter stitch using knit stitches only, because you can make garter stitch using just all pearl stitches each row, or it could be all knit stitches. But there is a difference actually in the, surprisingly, there is a difference in the size of the stitches and what I cast on. Now, if you put them side by side, it's garter stitch. You wouldn't think there would be a difference. Again, it's exactly the same yarn. So for the knitted garter stitch, I cast on 25 stitches. My gauge worked out to be 5 stitches per inch and 10 rows per inch. On my pearl garter stitch, which was every row was pearl, I cast on 24 stitches. My gauge was 4 3/4 stitches per inch. So gross that up, that was 4, 8, 12, 16, 17, 18, 19 over the 4 inches, I think, and 10.5 rows per inch. So slight differences, but nevertheless, just a difference in the stitch, because a pearl stitch is slightly narrower than the knit stitch, I found, with my gauge. And I changed needle size as well. So obviously knitting my garter stitch, I needed a bigger needle, and knitting my pearl garter stitch, I needed a smaller needle. So don't assume that if a pattern, again, you know, this is a great example of it's the same stitch to the eye, but actually the gauge needed to be different, because my personal tension is obviously a little bit different when I'm knitting pearl stitches as to when I'm knitting just straightforward knit stitches. And that's often the case. You do find that people can often do one type of stitch perfectly to the gauge required, another type of stitch not so much, and that's obviously the case with me. So I know when I purl, I have to be a bit careful with my my personal tension, but knit stitches not so much. So that is a whole thing about gauge and tension and the differences, and I hope that was helpful. I'm just going to swing you back up again now. This is the tricky bit, which I hope you'll be able to see me again in a second, because I always like to sort of sign off and talk to you when you can see me. Okay, hopefully, oh yes, I can see myself again, so I know you're there. I really hope you found that useful. If I know that was a lot to take in. Oh, you can just see the top of my head there, sorry. Let me move that down a bit. Okay, hopefully that's better. Hopefully that's better. So I hope you found that useful, but it is so interesting when you think about, you know, gauge, attention. It's just that small thing that we do that we have to do, but learn to love your swatches. Use them for all sorts of things. You know, you can actually, I love them, as you can see, but even if I didn't do them for the certification program, I would still do my swatches and hang on to them. They're super useful. You can play about with them for trims and buttons, and you can see how the fabric behaves when you're actually laundering it, if it's a garment that's going to be laundered. So, you know, your swatches are much more useful than you think, and they're certainly going to save you masses of time and perhaps heartbreak in the long run. And they'll certainly save you losing your temper. There's nothing worse than investing all that time in something and then it doesn't work out as you want. So I hope you found that useful. If there's any questions at all about gauge or tension, do please put them in the comments below and I will get back to you as soon as possible afterwards. I'm sorry we've overrun by 7 minutes. I do apologize. So this episode and all others are uploaded to our Facebook page and our YouTube channel, and Knit Matters YouTube channel afterwards. If you're searching for this one in future, it's season 2, episode 23, and you can watch the replays at any time. Thank you so much again for watching me. I do hope you'll join me again next week or for our next episode. In the meantime, stay well, stay calm, and stay knitting. Bye for now.